Oftentimes, you're going to find a series of quilt blocks in Kimberbell projects that we call filler blocks. We've also referred to them in the past as blank blocks, since there's no additional applique or filled designs on top of the block. Using filler blocks gives a nice balance to the design. Since adding an actual applique or filled quilt design on top of a block pulls the fabric a little bit, then it makes it so that we need to cut our blocks larger. Stitch our background quilting design, stitch our design on top of it, and then cut it down to size. But in the case of filler blocks, or even pieced blocks, there's no additional machine embroidery on top of the background quilting, so therefore we can cut to the exact size of the block we need for the quilt. When doing filler blocks, we use Technique 2 that is included in your download with the background quilting files. After I'm done showing you the steps, I'm also going to share my top 7 tips for quilting your filler blocks in the hoop. To provide extra structure to the fabric and to reduce puckering, we also recommend using Kimberbell's fusible backing in addition to the light mesh cutaway stabilizer. Again, you won't use this method we call Technique 2 on blocks that require additional applique. There's just too much pushing and pulling of the fabric in that case. Instead, we will use Technique 2 only on our filler or our pieced blocks. A helpful chart for cutting your batting is also included on the download. It's just a few pages, so it'll be really easy to find. You can refer to that chart or simply cut a piece of batting that is larger than your placement line. So let's go ahead and get started. After hooping your cutaway stabilizer, stitch the batting placement line. Place the batting completely covering the placement line and tape in place. Next, stitch the batting tack down line and remove your tape. Trim the batting close to the stitch line. Place your hoop back onto the machine and stitch the fabric placement line. Place the background fabric right side up, matching the edges of the fabric with the stitch line. Tape down all 4 edges. Since those edges are taped, you can actually skip step number 4 on your machine. Then change your thread to the color you wish and stitch the background quilting. Now, how easy was that? Now that we're done, here are my top 7 tips for quilting your filler blocks. Tip number 1, before cutting your block, use a little spray starch to stiffen it. After spraying and pressing, then cut your block to the size that you wish. Here's where I also add a layer of fusible backing to the wrong side of the fabric. Tip number 2, make sure you are using new paper tape. It's tempting to reuse that tape over and over again, but in this case, we want the stick to actually stick, right? Using a new piece each time is going to make sure that the fabric doesn't shift one bit. If you'd like to conserve tape, you can also tear it right down the middle and tape it in place. Tip number 3, tape the entire length of the block from one end to the next. I actually like to start by taping one side and then I tape its opposite side. Then finally, the last 2 sides. It's important that it extends the length because anything short of that will pull your fabric. Tip number 4, when you go to place your tape, all you really need to do is place the tape about 1/8 of an inch inside the perimeter of the block. That way you won't have to remove the tape later since it's going to be sewn into your seam. Which brings me to my next tip. Tip number 5, to use strips of Kimberbell's sticky back wash away stabilizer instead of tape. That's right. All I did was cut this stabilizer into 1/2-inch strips, then peeled it back and placed it down onto the block. By doing this, I'm not too concerned about how far the tape goes into the block because hey, it's washable. This works especially well if using a design that has traveling stitches that will be caught under the tape. Of course, our paper tape is easily removable, but washing it away with water is also really quite simple. Tip number 6, cut the block to size without removing the tape. All I do is pop the project from the hoop and then cut it down to size from there. You certainly could remove the tape, but again, if it's in your seam, there really is no need to do that. Tip number 7, I always suggest making a test block before you quilt. That way you can take a look at the tension on the back and see if there's any unnecessary pulling. It's funny how even a small amount of pulling can change the size of your block ever so slightly. So check it out. Maybe you have a machine like I do, where I know it does not like pre-wound bobbins for my background quilting. So for me, I've realized that a machine wound bobbin is the way to go. Every machine is different, so find out what works best for your situation. And finally, if you'd like to cut your filler blocks oversized and use technique number 1, you certainly can do that too. It's all up to you. Some people may prefer to cut them larger to begin with, and that's okay. This works well for individual blocks. But if you are sewing blocks together, you're going to need to make sure you account for those seam allowances as well. So there you have it. Give it a whirl, as I like to say, and see for yourself how fun quilting your blocks on your embroidery machine can be.